Sorry about that glitch. My phone just turned off the video because my phone was full and I had to delete some apps and some photographs. So sorry about this, and videos. Okay, we left off about the government of China in these three dynasties redistributing land to the landless poor. Part of it was out of the goodness of their hearts. They were following the goodness of Confucius, but it was also for their own benefit because if there was any class that was rivaling the government class, it would have been the aristocracy, the wealthy landowning class. So, in a way, by giving more land to landless poor, it was taking away, to some degree, some power away from the aristocracy. Um, Also, it helped in a larger way by giving more Chinese the opportunity to lift themselves up out of dire poverty into at least the lower of the lower middle classes, helping to diversify the economy, which helps society in general and helps those people specifically. All right, it's time for question. This is the first question, isn't it? Yeah, it's the first question. Here it is. The first question on our lecture. Don't worry, there are only like four. One, number one, A. What made the civil service examinations a good way to choose government officials? And number 1B, in what way was this method of choosing officials flawed? That is, not so good. Okay. So we're going to go on and talk about the second theme, which is the economy, an important underpinning of society. And during these three dynasties, the economy of China really flourished for a lot of reasons. In the past, the economy flourished because of improvements in agriculture, in crops, in plowing, tools and whatnot, in irrigation and other things like that. In this era, I'm going to say that the biggest changes to the economy were a result of an increase in trade. And this is trade within China. It's trade on a regional basis, that is with other places like Korea, Japan, Southeast Asia, India. And it even goes farther than that because during this time, we see China trading even as far as the Arabian Empire, the Islamic empires, and as far as Europe, or at least the Mediterranean Sea. Europe was kind of in dire straits at this time. So anyway, this opens up huge markets for Chinese products. And remember, the Chinese had very unique products, things like silk and porcelain and other things that block printing that the rest of the world really didn't have, so it really valued. And when you have lots of demand for your products, that helps your economy and your society in general. So, what are some of the things that helped trade during this period of time? Well, I mentioned one of them, which was the land redistribution to the landless poor, but maybe even more so was the development of two means of trade. And the first one was the completion of the Grand Canal. The Grand Canal was an artificial river, a canal, that was basically a north-south canal that connected the three river systems of China. And I think if you remember, the geography of China and the way it was populated and basically civilized was along these different river valleys. Because China, as every other major civilization in ancient times, developed on the backbone of a strong agricultural economy. That's what fed them. That's what gave them their great numbers in population. It allowed them to diversify in all sorts of ways. That goes back to September or October. But anyway, the Grand Canal basically cut through these three systems that were entirely east-west. And it was a north-south canal that connected these different river systems to one another. So it was an artificial river that cut across different geographies. And if we think about the southern river systems versus the northern river systems, the southern river systems would be where they would grow things like rice. While in the north they wouldn't grow rice, they'd grow millet and corn and wheat and other things like that. So even the movement of as basic a product as grain was important with the Grand Canal. And I can't overemphasize the amount of work that something like this would have taken. It was a grand engineering project to basically dig out a river pretty much by hand, um, and took hundreds and hundreds of years and much forced labor. And there was much tragedy and suffering that went along with this. But in the end, it helped the Chinese economy. Um, so that was one thing that really helped trade in a northwest fashion a north-south fashion within China. That Grand Canal also hooked up ultimately to the capital of China, Chang'an, which was the terminus of the Silk Road, which is the great trading network to the west. And Silk Road is kind of a misnomer because we think that the Silk Road is an actual road that goes from one place to another. And really, when we refer to the Silk Road, it's really the sum of all trading between China and the larger world to the west. That some of it did take place overland from the capital Chang'an to points west, but also took place via boat around Southeast Asia and India and into the Arab world and even into Europe and Africa. Anyway, these long distance trade networks really did help the economy greatly of China. One fact that your book noted was that there were 100,000 merchants in the city of Canton on the south side of China, on the southern coastal city. That alone in one city shows how drastically the Chinese economy has changed into one of just agricultural production to one that's very diversified, where we've got 100,000 people in one city acting only as traders. Think of what also is included in an economy like that. It's artisans and manufacturers and, of course, agriculture and people to transport and all sorts of jobs that help for a very diversified and healthy economy. The other thing, we talked about Silk Road, we talked about the Grand Canal, are the growth in manufacturing and the development of new products. We always had silk and porcelain and things like that, but now we had block printing, as I said, and cotton was introduced. And once the Chinese got hold of cotton, they grew it endlessly, and now clothing was more than not woven from cotton, as opposed to other materials. They also developed steel and gunpowder at this time. Gunpowder would eventually be used against them, but that's for a later point. All right, enough about the economy. So, question number 2. You ready? Name 2 factors that made trade grow during these 3 dynasties. That's easy, I just told you. Name 2 factors that made trade grow during these 2 dynasties. All right, now I'm going to talk a little bit about family life in these 3 dynasties. Girls, I know that I've talked a lot about how males have subjected females over time. More of the same here in China. And I'm just going to give you 5 facts. This is for everyone. But I address you young women because, history is a lot about the subjugation of women, which is really sad. The good side of that is that we are moving in the right direction toward greater equality. But as you read it in your chapter, here are 5 simple facts. Number 1, husbands could take a second wife if the first wife did not produce a male heir. And yet the wife could not divorce that husband that took a second wife. Number 2, girls were considered inferior because they couldn't do any valuable work. Of course not. Number 3, they were just an extra mouth to feed because they really were only a temporary part of the family, because eventually they'd be married off and they'd become part of someone else's family. Not only that, but they had to pay a dowry, that is money, to the groom's family once she did get married. God, what a burden. Number 4, sadly enough, infant girls were often killed during famines. I mean, that's awful. And number 5, poor families, another awful thing, would often sell their daughters to wealthy people as concubines, just so that they would take them off of their hands. Of course, the one exception it talked about was the woman named Wu, Wu Chao, who basically became the Empress of China, as if this is going to prove that Chinese culture didn't oppress women, because of this one woman who lied, cheated, and stole her way to power. and was very much the exception as a woman. Oh, she was later deposed once she became rather elderly. So we won't talk about Wu Chao. We're going to finish up by talking about the couple of dynasties after these three, the Sui, the Tang, and the Song. We haven't talked about external threats to China. The external threats to China were great, especially from the west and particularly from the north. Do you remember the Great Wall? Well, that was to keep the northerners out. Do you remember Mulan? And the Huns? And her boyfriend? Watch it. It's a good time to watch that movie. Well, during this period of time, after the Song Dynasty, we see great pressure from the northern nomads known as the Mongols. The Mongols lived in Mongolia, the present country of Mongolia, in the Gobi Desert, and they were terrific horsemen. And their society was basically built around horses, and their method of warfare was very, very much built on horses, which was really very daunting against an infantry-laden army like China had. Anyway, toward the end of the Song Dynasty, the Song had, as you read, hired the Mongols to keep out other people, and of course the Mongols turned on them and basically invaded the Song, ending their dynasty. But the Mongols weren't all that bad because they actually initiated the next dynasty in China, and this was in the hereditary line of the great Khans known as Genghis Khan of the Mongols in the 1200s, and then his grandson Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan specifically started the Yuan dynasty. Interestingly, they changed the capital, but they didn't change a lot of Chinese culture. They pretty much adopted it. The Mongols did stay somewhat separate as a governing class apart from the Chinese, but the Chinese very much went on with their lives, just sort of being ruled by these foreign rulers. And this is the period of time when actually Marco Polo came to China and marveled at the prosperity and peace that occurred in China. This is during the Mongol occupation. The Mongols would return and come back again in future dynasties. After the Yuan dynasty, there was court intrigue, and there were other problems, and the economy went downhill, and then we see a new dynasty, really briefly here, the Ming dynasty. This is the last dynasty that we're going to see that really is outward looking toward the outer world. After this, China will sort of look inward and really be only focused on its own agricultural production and its own culture for a long time. Anyway, the Ming dynasty was fairly brief, but a notable ruler was Hongwu, who continued in the tradition of land reform. He strengthened the central government. He restored Chinese control over Southeast Asia, specifically in Vietnam, and he sponsored a series of explorations with a guy from his court named Zheng He. It looks like Zhen He. But this guy was actually for a while purported to maybe have discovered the Western Hemisphere. I think they've proven now that he actually didn't. He only went as far as maybe the west coast of Africa. But again, in the tradition of these earlier dynasties, the Ming dynasty was very outward looking. Why would they want to explore? To look at new markets, to look for new contacts, to find places for more natural resources, to discover new lands. Whenever you see exploration, that is a good thing, and you know that a dynasty or a civilization in general is pretty prosperous. And that leads us to the end of this short lecture. And my third and final question, which is, name something about Chinese culture from this chapter that you either really appreciate or that you really dislike. And why do you appreciate or dislike it? Okay? Name something about Chinese culture from this chapter that you really either appreciate or really dislike. And why do you appreciate or dislike it? And that is it. Okay. Google Doc from your initial quiz before the lecture, and then the 3 questions from this brief lecture. Sorry I had to splice it into 2 different videos. Take care. I'll see you next week.